Harris was born and raised in the countryside. His family was poor, and the boy learned from childhood what labor and need were. His mother raised him alone, and Harris knew how hard it was for her. That was why when he grew older, he decided to stay in the village. His mother tried to persuade him to think it over and still go to the city because it was difficult to find a job in their village, not to mention a bride. But Harris said he would only leave with her. "Oh, I'm used to living here, in the silence of the forest. Besides, my parents are buried here. How can I leave them?" lamented his mother. You see, Harris hugged his mother. "You don't want to leave your parents, but you advise me to do so." "No, I'm staying here. By the way, I was offered the position of forester, and I accepted. As for a bride, if it's meant to be, I'll find her here." "Yeah, in the woods," joked the mother and shook her head. One day, Harris was making his rounds of the territory entrusted to him, and as usual, he walked especially carefully along the area along the highway. Next year, often the townspeople abandoned their cars and had picnics with bonfires. This time, all was quiet, and he headed deeper into the woods. But after walking 5 kilometers, Harris suddenly heard a woman crying. Thinking that it was another hiker who got lost, he quickly followed the sound. After a few minutes, he was surprised to see a young woman in a wedding dress, sitting under a huge tree. True, the dress was pretty shabby and dirty in the mud, and there was no trace of makeup and hair, but the girl was still incredibly beautiful. When she saw Harris, she jumped up and wanted to run, but her strength left her and she slumped to the ground again. Harris introduced himself and tried to find out something about her, but all he heard was that her name was Amelia. All other questions, the girl remained silent, and in response to his offer to help her get out of the forest, she shook her head negatively, and only when Harris warned her that because of the vicinity of the wild animals' lairs, it was not safe to stay here, especially at night. She said, "I can't go home, then let's go to my place." "Don't be afraid. I live with my mother, and you won't be in any danger." "As I'm not afraid of you," Amelia smiled through her tears. Harris took the young woman home. Mrs. Brooke, seeing who her son had brought, spluttered her hands and hustled around the guest. In less than an hour, Amelia, in a warm robe, rosy after the shower, was already sitting at the table and eagerly ate everything Mrs. Brooke offered her. No one asked her a question, and she was grateful to these kind people for their understanding. Harris's mother, noticing that the poor girl was sleepy, put her to bed and then sat with her son for a long time in the kitchen, wondering who the stranger was and what brought her to the wooded wilderness. Meanwhile, Amelia, falling asleep, thought about the fact that for the first time in her life, she had met truly sincere and kind people. She grew up in a very different family. Her parents were wealthy people. Her mother loved and pampered Amelia greatly, but when she was 6 years old, she became seriously ill and died a few years later. Amelia missed her mother, often asked her father about her, but he, devastated and immersed in grief, did not pay any attention to his daughter. As time passed, the pain dulled, and one day the arrogant beauty Pamela showed up at their house. Amelia lacked a mother's warmth and reached out to her, but Pamela always stopped her with an icy stare. "Amelia, go to your room, you're bothering me," said the father's new sweetheart often. "I'll just sit next to you." "I will be in the way," the girl asked. "Don't you understand? I have a lot to do." Amelia grew older. Pamela became more and more irritated, and then suddenly the father decided to send his daughter to study abroad. Amelia did not want to go and desperately resisted, but her father insisted, promising that he would visit her. Finally she agreed, but he deceived her and never came. Pamela gave birth to his 2 children during this time, and he was fully immersed in the new family, not even thinking about how hard it was for his daughter, alone in a foreign country. All her studying years, Amelia looked forward to coming home, but it was not as joyful as she had imagined. Shortly before she arrived, her father called her and told her that he had found her a fiancé, and that they were looking forward to her return to have the wedding. Amelia tried to explain that now was not the time, and she would marry only for love, but her father just said a dry goodbye, offering to finish the conversation at home. And home, Amelia realized to her horror that he was serious. Clark was his business partner and was old enough to be her father, but not her husband. Amelia's father explained that his business was on the verge of bankruptcy, and that the only way to improve things was to become related to Clark. Amelia was horrified, and she did not want to believe that her father could be so cruel to her. "Daddy, I don't want to," cried the girl. He's old." "Don't be silly. He is still full of strength." And you'll even have time to give birth and raise children. What's more, you won't be in need of anything. Amelia wanted to object, but her father no longer listened to her. When Clark came to visit them for the first time, he tried to be polite, but when he realized that Amelia did not want to communicate with him, he dropped the mask of the goody-goody and whispered ominously, "Stop playing with me. Sir, you will soon become a beggar and will beg me for salvation. I have been fond of you for a long time, and I have done everything to get a hold of your father's business and force him to marry you off to me. Your father owes me a large sum of money, and if he can't pay it back, he'll go to jail. Well, what do you say now? Do you agree now?" Amelia nodded frightenedly as, on her wedding day, she, wearing a beautiful white dress, stood in front of the mirror and cried nonstop. To calm herself, she went out into the garden to get some fresh air, and suddenly she heard Pamela talking on the phone. "Don't even think of any wedding night. Clark, you know how much I love you. I've thought of everything, believe me. As soon as the papers are signed, we'll get rid of both of them at once." She added with a chuckle, and suddenly she noticed her stepdaughter, who was dumb with horror. Pamela took a step toward Amelia, but she was already running. She jumped into the car and pressed down on the gas pedal, racing as fast as she could, and soon she was well outside the city. As she went on one of the dangerous turns, the car skidded and overturned. Amelia, by some miracle, was not hurt, and with difficulty got out of the car, went into the woods, not knowing the road, until finally lost her way. If Harris had not found her, no one knows how it would have ended. Amelia stayed at the home of Harris and his mother for 2 weeks. Those were the happiest days of her life. She helped Mrs. Brooke around the house and often spent time with Harris. One evening, while talking with him in the woods, the girl could not stand it and kissed the man. He could no longer hide his feelings either, and having given themselves to passion. Harris and Amelia became close, and the next day, Amelia's father showed up on their doorstep. "Oh, I finally found you. I was so worried about you," he exclaimed with anxiety in his voice. "Daddy, I will not marry Clark, and I'm not coming home. He and Pamela are plotting something against us. I heard it myself. I know, dear, there will be no more Pamela and Clark in our lives. I promise," said the father, and told her that the detective he had hired to look for her had accidentally uncovered the criminal scheme of his wife and her lover. It turned out that Pamela had long been having an affair with Clark, and he was his children's real father. The man almost begged his daughter to forgive him and not leave him at such a difficult time. Amelia looked at Harris and Mrs. Brooke and knew from their eyes that they felt sorry for the poor man, and that if she turned her back on him now, she would disappoint the people who had become dear to her. "Let's go home, Daddy," she said quietly, and left the house. Harris's life went back to normal, and he forbade himself to think about how much he missed Amelia. But a month later, there was a knock on the door, and Harris was astonished to see Amelia and her father on the doorstep. "We're back," she announced cheerfully. "Daddy decided to leave the city and bought a house in your village. Indeed, it will be better for our child to live in the countryside." Harris, stunned by such news, looked at Amelia for a few seconds, not believing his happiness, and then hugged her tightly and kissed her.